Chinese attempts to influence Australian politics have been a recurring story through 2019, and the last parliamentary sitting of the year began today amidst explosive claims of Chinese spying. But the government has to contend with less sensational political problems too. Here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle with her take from Canberra.
The heat over sophisticated foreign actors trying to infiltrate our politics, and particularly our parliament, has been building for a few years now. The subtext, often politely not mentioned, has usually been that the main culprits have been the Chinese. There have been hacking attempts on the parliamentary IT system, on the Weather Bureau, and on federal departments. But the weekend has seen a dramatic escalation of this pressure. First, reports of a young Chinese man, Wang Lichuan, seeking asylum in Australia, claiming he had been working for Chinese intelligence in Australia, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Then, even more shockingly, claims of another man, Nick Zhao, being found dead in a Melbourne motel room after approaching ASIO with claims that the Chinese were pressuring him to run for Parliament in the seat of Chisholm with a promised $1 million to bankroll his campaign.
Amazing.
But if all this was not extraordinary enough, ASIO Chief Mike Burgess took the extremely unusual step of releasing a statement late last night confirming the spy organisation was already actively investigating these claims. This puts these stories on a whole new plane. ASIO rarely speaks publicly, directly, and usually only to say it would not be publicly commenting. Today, even the Prime Minister was not walking away from the stories.
I find the allegations deeply disturbing and troubling.
These issues obviously have wide ramifications for the China-Australia relationship. The Chinese embassy also took the rare step of releasing a statement suggesting the man claiming asylum is a fraudster. The weekend's revelations have brought home just how extensive the Chinese attempts to influence Australian politics have become, and how alarmed our intelligence institutions are about it. But even without the Chinese trying to infiltrate the Parliament, there were questions today about how effective Parliament is at holding our own politicians, and particularly ministers, to account.
There are very few standards these days that government ministers get held to. And basically the last one is that a minister must not mislead the House.
Energy Minister Angus Taylor remains under pressure on a number of issues, but particularly over his release of doctored documents about the travel expenses of the Mayor of the City of Sydney, Clover Moore.
The words were, from the Minister, an assurance to the House. The document was drawn directly from the City of Sydney's website. Now, on all the public evidence, that cannot be true.
The government appears determined to tough out these suggestions of misleading. After all, there are only 2 more weeks of parliamentary sittings before Christmas. But the Prime Minister was under attack on another front today.
Will you have the courage to apologise to the victims of the bushfires for exporting record amounts of thermal coal?
Oh,
Our
rubbish.
government knows about the need to take action on climate change, and our record demonstrates we are meeting and beating our commitments.
The government was keen today to let voters know it's taking action to address problems in our aged care system, announcing over $500 million of spending as an immediate response to problems identified earlier this month by the interim report of the Aged Care Royal Commission. But earlier this month, 7:30 reported
This is
on
only quite
in the Victorian town of Murchison
amateurish
on the brink of closure.
screen capture, but here we go. Right, I'll discuss this a bit further later.
3 weeks later, the home is in liquidation and staff and residents remain in limbo.
On the explosive influence in Australia, to what end?
Well, the short answer is that it wants to control all of its periphery and exposures in the world to suit itself. But the slightly more involved answer lies in the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and its origins as a covert guerrilla revolutionary movement in the 1920s, when it was a small, feeble outfit, and it adopted this sort of paranoid mentality, really, that it has to be secretive, that everything is a threat, and it must constantly seek to protect itself by extending its influence outwards. And even though China today doesn't really seem to fit with that description of being small, weak, feeble and vulnerable, it's now this massive superpower, but that is still the animating ideology and psychology behind the way it behaves. Some people are uncomfortable talking about this or don't want to talk about it, but there is a department of the Chinese government called the United Front Work Department that exists and has always existed to covertly extend Chinese state influence through the Chinese diasporas abroad. And even the President of China himself publicly called the United Front Work Department one of China's three magic weapons. So this is something that we have to take seriously, and that's why they're the reasons that we have been the canary, or the Chinese put it the other way around and say that we've actually been the most aggressive in trying to antagonise the Chinese in their words, but protect ourselves in ours.
Can you give me a few of the examples you've pulled together in this quarterly essay of China attempting to pressure top Australian politicians?
Well, there's the startling story of when Joe Hockey was first made Treasurer, and after 3 days only in the job, had a meeting in a thatched Balinese hut at a G20 meeting with his Chinese counterpart, Liu Jiwei.
Right.
And Liu Jiwei's opening comment was, "Why won't you let me buy Rio Tinto?" And when Hockey obviously parried, he came back with, "Well, look, I just want to buy 15% of your top 200 listed companies." This was a pretty bracing moment for Joe Hockey, and a story that he's regaled people with out of amazement and shock as much as anything else. Another one was when three of the leaders of the Labor Party, so Hockey obviously is Liberal, this one is Labor, when Shorten was Labor leader, together with Penny Wong, Richard Marles, met the Chinese Minister for State Security at the time when the Chinese wanted to establish an extradition treaty with Australia. And the government, the Turnbull government, was on board. Labor was reluctant. The Chinese minister said, do this deal. And when the Labor leadership said, we're not really interested, he threatened them, saying, it would be a terrible shame if I had to tell the Chinese community in Australia that the Labor Party was anti-Chinese.
And what was Labor's response to that?
Well, they rejected the threat, turned down the extradition treaty. That killed the bill. And of course it was an extradition treaty that started all the turmoil now underway in Hong Kong.
China buys a third of everything that Australia sells to the world.
Yeah, all right.
Our economy is very dependent on it.
That's true.
What's the risk for Australia here, and how should it be managed?
Well, the Chinese have an established state policy of using economic coercion to influence countries. A couple of quick things you can do about that. One is a suggestion by Peter Varghese, the former head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who's now the Chancellor of Queensland University. He says, look, our universities are so open to Chinese money, and we are so dependent on Chinese money, we should think about taking a part of the annual revenues from our Chinese student flow, instead of just spending it all on recurrent expenses every year, take a portion, put it in a fund, a long-term fund, call it an investment fund or a scholarship fund, and you have that as a buffer in the event that the student flow, the tap is suddenly turned off through no fault of our own. In Queensland...
Well, anyway, I thought I'd make a few comments and add a little bit to what we've been seeing about things that are going on with these Chinese spies and other things. Efforts to influence our country's political systems, and it doesn't matter which side we're talking about. Apparently they're attempting to get into politics to the point where, as you saw from one of the reports here on the 7:30 show on ABC, one person was offered $1 million, a car salesman, would you believe, to go into Parliament. And then when that person reported that fact to ASIO, he was found dead. So, as the saying goes, it's a bit like something out of a movie or a Pulp Fiction. But the whole thing, by the way, is much more serious than that. I've mentioned some of these things in the past, and some people scoff at me. They laugh. They say, oh, no, we're never going to have a war. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Oh, that's all right. But then old hands around the place, people who know the history a bit, well, they'll recall things like the peace in our time declaration in 1938 by Neville Chamberlain, and British Prime Minister, I think he was at the time, or Foreign Minister. And sure enough, Britain was at war with Germany in 1939. These sorts of things are happening. They're developing. There are even videos on YouTube, of course, saying that the World War III has already commenced, but I don't think so. I think there are a number of incidents and a number of areas of concern. China is just one of them. I think we ought to keep an eye on this, and don't be surprised if the day comes when America is actually at war, I'm talking shooting war, with China. In which case, in Australia, we'd have no exports of the iron ore and coal and gas and whatever else we send to China. That'll all stop immediately. Imports of Chinese goods would stop immediately. So Kmart and Target and other similar stores, put your name on them if you like, get their goods from China. They would close down within a matter of weeks. There are many, many other things that will take place, and I don't really want to go into them now, and I have discussed them in brief in the past, and I was only talking to my brother today about these things, and he says he feels quite firmly that the internet will be closed down and made into military only, and that will be one of the things that will happen that will totally put the wind up millions of people. So anyone who's got shares in things like, let's say Bitcoin, they need to quietly get out of that, and fairly soon. I'm not predicting, by the way, these things to occur within weeks or a few months or whatever it might be. But I am saying that I expect it to occur within a year or two, or a little longer perhaps. But when it does, I don't want anyone to be surprised, and when the internet is lost, they can't very well respond to me on that one. So only friends and family could ring me and say, you've discussed all this. And in fact, my son-in-law said, Dad, you've been talking about this for 6 years or 7 years or something. Well, that's okay, son, Anyway, guys, I thought I'd put my opinion out there and my feelings on the issue. And I welcome any considered opinion, any questions, any thoughts on the matter in a civil and polite way. I'm not looking for any form of abuse, of course, but I'll leave it with you, and I hope that you find my thoughts at least of interest. So thank you for viewing.